Hi, everybody. So welcome to Managing Emotions, Family Relationships, and Elderly Parents Who Refuse Help. I'm Pamela D Wilson, caregiving expert, advocate, and speaker, and I am your guide for this program. We're going to talk about the emotional ups and downs of being a caregiver. And in this part, we're going to talk about life's most stressful events and how these all relate to caregiving. Many times you will see me down here in the corner of the slides. Other times I will take myself off so that the internet speed transmits this webinar quickly. So we're going to begin here. I'll take myself off and I'll see you again in a few minutes. Let's talk about some few housekeeping items. Throughout this module, I use the term elderly parent or elderly parents. You can substitute that term for whatever term you need. Spouse, husband, wife, partner, grandparent, a friend, the person that you receive care, a client, or a patient. The outline for this module is in the materials for the course in the online program, and I do suggest, if you haven't done this yet, print the slides for every section so that you can make notes. In the slides, you'll notice that I have put ellipses, dots, and these are on purpose so that you follow along with me throughout this webinar, so that you learn and you pay attention. So let's talk about the objectives for managing emotions, family relationships, and elderly parents who refuse care. At the end of this section, you should be able to identify stressors related to caregiving, recognize why trying to do it all places the health of caregivers at risk, create strategies for managing relationships, and most importantly, adopt realistic expectations about caring for elderly parents and loved ones. Unrealistic expectations are the main reason that caregiving situations so easily go off track. The objectives of the part that we're talking about is the emotional ups and downs of being a caregiver. In this part, you should be able to identify stressful events in the life of a caregiver and the list of all of the complexities of trying to work and be a caregiver. You'll be able to recite the 4 stages of caregiving, recognize the importance of caregivers asking for help, especially when you are the primary caregiver for an elderly parent. Many caregivers find themselves in that situation. Let's start with the life's most stressful events. Caregiving represents the unexpected. If you look at the infographic that shares most of life's stressful events, we'll go through these one at a time. But the stressful events include the death of a spouse or a close family member, marital relationships, separations and divorce, the stress of personal injury or illness, working caregiver concerns, early and regular retirement, and gaining a new family member. One way that I put caregiving into perspective is to look at the idea of being diagnosed with a chronic disease. A chronic disease is a diagnosis like high blood pressure, diabetes, COPD or breathing issues, arthritis, or another type of health diagnosis that is not immediately life-threatening. You're not going to die tomorrow from these diseases, but they might be considered a hassle or just one more thing that you have to deal with. Upon being diagnosed with a chronic disease, many times the responses are denial, fear, asking about consequences, or looking for a solution or a cure. Some of the questions people typically ask are, I have high blood pressure. How did this happen and what can I do about it? When did the condition start? Why didn't I notice this before? What are the consequences? How do I deal with this? Being proactive with a health diagnosis, like responding to all events in our life, offers the opportunity to manage or improve a situation. Being in denial, disinterested, or refusing to accept a chronic disease diagnosis is likely to lead to more health problems. The big picture goal of the Caring Generation series and the modules within these programs is to offer practical steps to be proactive. The information provided is valuable for all participants. Caregiving is not a subject generally discussed until a need exists. If you are a caregiver in this program, the information can be used to benefit your health, your well-being, and planning for your care and the care of your elderly parents and loved ones. Let's move ahead and talk more about the number one stressful event in life, which is death. I'm going to bring myself on the camera here because I want to talk about the idea of I don't do funerals. I have been a professional caregiver for over 20 years, and caregiving for me started out at a very young age. My mother was sick beginning in my teens. When I was 17 years old, my oldest sister, who was a nurse, was accidentally killed in a car accident. That was my first immediate experience with family death, except for my grandfather. I attended a funeral when I was 5 years old, and it was my grandfather's funeral, and my mother took me. After the death of my sister, I was 17 years old. My parents took the death very hard. They said, you know, parents are supposed to die first. Parents should never lose a child. Throughout my teens, into my 20s, into my 30s, my mother had bad health. And her brothers and sisters began dying from things like heart disease, strokes. They had other health issues. One of them was an alcoholic, so she had issues relating to alcohol. But all of these people, I noticed, started passing away. And my mother's health, she had heart problems because she was a lifelong smoker. Back then, when she grew up, they didn't know that smoking was bad for you or really how bad smoking was for you. Didn't know the importance of exercise, of good nutrition, didn't have all of the medical advances that we have today. As a result, my mother passed away when I was in my 30s. My father passed away a couple of years after my mother, and my oldest brother passed away about a year after my father. He was in his late 50s and he had leukemia. So after all of those deaths, I really was the person who said, I am not going to another funeral. I don't do funerals. I don't like death. And that was more because of the emotional effect that death had on me. I had no experience on how you're supposed to grieve a death or how you manage through that. I just did it. But I will say that I went to counseling also to learn how to manage all this grief I had, because in a period of 5 years, I lost 3 immediate family members. That is the number one stressor, death. And so what I learned from all of that was that I really loved older people. And I looked back to my earlier years when I got out of high school. I had a social work scholarship to the University of Nebraska at Omaha that I did not take because I was worried about paying the tuition. How would I work and go to school? How would I do all that? So I gave up the scholarship and I worked full time and I went to school at night. But after all of these losses, I decided that I wanted to do the one thing that I was interested in when I was 17 years old. When I was back at my parents' home cleaning it out, because I was their trustee, I was going through the books in my bookcase at the house. And in one of the books, there was a little yellow piece of paper sticking up out of one of the books. And I looked at it and it said, things I want to do when I grow up. How prophetic. So the prophecy was fly jets, join the Peace Corps, become a forest ranger, or take care of older people. And so I decided that I was going to take care of older people. And so for the past 20 years, I have been a caregiving expert, an advocate, and a speaker. I have helped thousands of clients. I was directly responsible for their care as a court-appointed guardian, a medical and financial power of attorney, personal rep of the estate, and trustee. I was with many of my clients when they passed away. So being the person who said, I don't do funerals, I don't do death, It's pretty amazing that I made something positive out of all of those losses, at least amazing to me. And I became the person to make sure that people, when they died, were not alone, did not die in pain, had all of the medical care that they needed. So let's continue with this presentation. I'll take myself back off camera and we'll go forward. Let's talk about caregiver death statistics because these are significant. According to an article by Schultz in a journal called JAMA, caregivers have a 63% higher mortality rate versus non-caregivers. According to a Stanford University study, 40% of Alzheimer's caregivers die before the person for whom they care. Other statistics have a 30% rate for caregivers dying before the person for whom they care. The effects of caregiver exhaustion, the results of being tired of caring for elderly parents and spouses, it's not made up. These are real facts, real statistics. These statistics tell us that we definitely need a backup plan and self-care for caregivers that is essential if we don't want to become one of these statistics. One of the next most stressful situations is the death of a spouse. Becoming a caregiver or needing care is a combination of these most stressful events in life. As we looked through that chart earlier, you'll see that the death of a spouse is number one, the most stressful event in life. Number 5 is the death of a close family member. Caregiving responsibilities, they have a defined end, whether we are caring for a spouse or an elderly parent or someone else. Let's talk about grief. Grieving the loss of a spouse can take 1 month for every year that a couple was together. For example, a couple together for 10 years, the grieving period would be about 10 months, maybe a year. Suicide of the surviving spouse can happen when that couple has been together for a long time. According to a study, suicide rates are the highest in the first week following the death, with more men than women committing suicide in older adults by a 9-to-2 ratio, 9 men to 2 women. For younger adults, the suicide rate is about equal at 50-50. If you lose a mother or a father, the recommendation is to offer additional support and contact throughout the first year, and especially during the first week, the first weeks, the first months after the death of your mother or father. Other stressful situations: marital relationships, separation, and divorce. So add to the stress of death are marital relationships, divorce, reconciliation, separation. During my 20 years of supporting caregivers, I have seen caring for elderly parents take a toll on marriages and relationships. I have seen separations and divorces result from health issues. When I was a professional fiduciary, one of my roles was to estimate healthcare costs in divorce settlements when one spouse had health issues that were going to require ongoing medical care. So let's say one spouse had Alzheimer's, or they had cancer or diabetes, some type of diagnosis that had related medical expenses. I actually estimated those expenses for the rest of life and provided that information to the attorneys who were doing the settlements. Other concerns that I became aware of were second marriages later in life that resulted in surprises of health diagnosis that were never expected. I had a client, a woman, who was married for 2 months when she discovered that her new husband had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. That marriage ended very quickly because she didn't marry him to be a caregiver for the rest of her life. She thought she was marrying him to have a partner, to enjoy retirement, and to travel. Her goal was not to be a caregiver. Let's talk about the stress of personal injury or illness. The sixth most stressful event in life is personal injury or illness. Until we have an accident or a diagnosis of chronic disease, we all believe that we are immune to injury or sickness. The severity of the injury or the condition may result in significant stress and affect all parts of our life. Health issues cross over into family relationships, the ability to work, go to school, and the ability to perform daily activities. Many of you know this if you are already caregivers, no matter what stage you're at, whether you've been doing this for 2 months, whether you're starting to do this, whether you've been a caregiver for years. Injuries resulting from a car accident or a sporting accident can change life significantly. On my website, there is a video, and it is called Eat Cookies. This is a video of a man called David. And David lived here in Denver, Colorado. He was a bodybuilder. He was in his middle 30s. David was sitting out with some friends one day on a retaining wall, and he fell backwards. That fall backwards resulted in significant injuries that were so significant that he was paralyzed from the neck down, paralyzed from here down. What that meant was that he had to be on a breathing machine called a ventilator. He had to be fed through feeding tubes. All of his physical care had to be provided by someone else. And at the time that David made the video that I will put a link to, he was in the hospital. He didn't have any of his legal documents done. No living will, no medical power of attorney, no financial power of attorney. So what this meant was that because he hadn't made those decisions before the fall and put them in writing, most people think they don't need them. If we're young, we don't think that anything is ever going to happen to us. My recommendation is to do your estate planning and your power of attorney documents right after the age of 21. Back to David. David did not want to live in the condition he was for the rest of his life. He was a bodybuilder. He was active. He was going around with his friends, working, having a very good life, in his opinion. A very good life, in his opinion, was not being paralyzed from the neck down and needing hands-on care for the rest of his life. He told the doctors at the hospital, "I don't want to live. I want you to take me off all of these machines, all of these life-sustaining measures. They have to go. I don't want this anymore." And the doctor said to him, "Well, David, you've had a serious accident. We don't know if you're thinking clearly. We don't know if your brain really understands what turning off all these machines mean." And David said, "I do know what it means. It's what I want." But unfortunately, because he hadn't done those power of attorney documents, it took almost a year of going through the hospital system, through David talking to doctors, which you will see the doctor in the video, to David talking to ethics committees and psychiatrists and psychologists about the fact that he did not want to live. Finally, after almost a year, his wishes were granted. They had a plan in 30 days to turn off all the equipment so that everybody that he wanted to see, his family could come see him, his friends could come see him. And unfortunately, as sometimes happens with people who are paralyzed from the neck down and their lives are being sustained by equipment, he came down with pneumonia and an infection, and he passed away naturally. This video is on my website. I'll post a link. It is about 17 minutes. If you or your elderly parents are unconvinced about why legal planning should be done, I can tell you that this video will convince you. Let's continue. So until unexpected accidents and personal injuries happen, we don't realize the importance of completing these legal documents: medical and financial power of attorney, a living will, a trust. Let's talk about working caregiver concerns. Working caregiver concerns are the 8th most stressful event in life. You'll notice that working caregiver concerns are on the chart, but they're listed as fired at work. I take fired at work one step further and translate this to the stress of being a working caregiver and trying to keep a job. Being fired is stressful. Working and caring for elderly parents involves concerns about remaining employed because caregivers come in late, leave early, take time off to care for an elderly parent. In a minute, I'll share some statistics from research reports about caregivers in the workplace that will either shock you or you will be nodding your head saying, yes, that is me. Let's talk about early and regular retirement. Retirement, believe it or not, we all want to do it, but it's the 10th most stressful life event. Early retirement is not always planned. In fact, it's rarely planned. What results in early retirement? It's personal injury or illness that results in some type of midlife health issue, some type of midlife disability. Disability for women in midlife happens because of physical declines. Many spouses will leave the workplace to care for a sick or disabled spouse. You'll see the note on this slide that says podcast called Managing Work-Life Balance. My radio program, The Caring Generation, has an episode called Managing Work-Life Balance that features a guest interview with Dr. Carrie Carbonen-Gutierrez about preventing midlife health concerns for women, because this is a big concern. Dr. Gutierrez talks about disability in non-traditional terms and how this affects women's health and the ability to continue to work. So when most of us think of disability, we think of a disability that totally disables our body. For most of us, disability is as simple as, I can't do what I did 3 weeks ago. I can't do what I did a month ago. For women, it's things like housework, bending, kneeling, picking up items. I've hurt my back, I've hurt my knee, I've hurt some other body part. So when we talk about midlife disability for women and how that affects their ability to continue to work, that's the type of disability that I'm referring to here. Another stressful event, gaining a new family member. You might think of this as having a baby. Having a baby is definitely gaining a new family member. But in this situation, the last stressful event that I relate to caregiving relative to the gain of a new family member is gaining care for an elderly parent, a spouse, or another person. The added responsibility of caring for an elderly parent, as many of you already know, it's significant. Sometimes adult children may choose to move an elderly parent into their home or move into the home of an elderly parent. Those are serious decisions to make. We'll talk about those in another module. So let's summarize what we talked about in the emotional ups and downs of being a caregiver. As you can see, you know this, the role of caregiving crosses over many areas of our lives that we may not think about until we become a caregiver. Married relationships, work, our personal interests, everything that we want to do is affected by being a caregiver. Caregiving or needing care, it's a significant life transition. We don't talk about it. It is equally as significant as moving out of your parents' house when you're young, getting married, planning for retirement. It is never too early to talk about caring for elderly parents or how to plan for being that person who eventually may need care. And I want to talk about change because change is relevant to caregiving. And there are 4 stages of change. The first one is shock. Many of you who became a caregiver, you never thought about being a caregiver. It was never talked about in your family. An unexpected event happened and you are shocked that you are a caregiver. You're thinking, how on earth did this happen? How am I going to manage it? What am I going to do to make this work out? Another part of change is experiencing anger. When we become a caregiver or any significant life change, we could be angry about what happened. We could say, oh, if only I had done this, or why did this happen? Or why did this have to happen to me? Everything always happens to me. I can never get a break. The next stage is where sometimes with change we bargain. we try to say, well, if I do this, maybe this won't happen, or if I change this, maybe it won't happen. But in caregiving, it doesn't go backwards. There's no bargaining with caregiving. The only bargaining may be to try to get other people to help you. So after we move through the bargaining stage, we then try to go to the planning stage where we say, okay, what are my options? How do I make this work out? How do I be a caregiver? Which is probably many of the reasons that you are here in this module, here in these programs, to find out how to work through things that you know about caregiving and things that you don't know about caregiving, which, as I have come to learn in the past 20 years, are significant. Then as we move through the stages, we may feel a little sad. We may feel a little depressed about the situation. Sad that our elderly parents are having health issues. Sad about how caregiving is affecting our lives. If it's affecting our family relationships, our marital relationships, do we not have time to go see our friends anymore? Things that we used to like to do, maybe we would go out with friends once a week for lunch, go to the gym, do all of these activities. And all of a sudden, that time that we had for ourselves is very small. So depression and grieving, the loss of free time, grieving our lives before caregiving, is very common as we move through the changes that surround the idea of caregiving. Then we come to the end, which is acceptance. Okay, I am a caregiver. I am caring for an elderly parent. This is likely to go on for 1, 10, 20 years, longer than we thought. And what we can gain from the idea of acceptance is the idea of opportunity. What does this change mean for my life? What can I learn? How can I grow from it? Caregivers who are the most successful look at caregiving as an opportunity to learn about health, to improve relationships with elderly parents or family members, and to really grow from the experience and use that experience to better their lives, their health. There are so many opportunities to be gained from being a caregiver, as you'll see throughout these programs. So let's wrap this up. I thank you for joining me for the emotional ups and downs of being a caregiver. By recognizing stressful events in the lives of caregivers, you should be able to initiate conversations with the family and in the workplace to support the care of your elderly parents. I'm Pamela D Wilson, caregiving expert, advocate, and speaker. I am your host, and I will see you in the next webinar.